Today I will tell you a story about betrayal, greed, and the quiet strength of a woman who refused to be erased. At my husband's will reading, my daughter would later declare that the $95 million empire belonged to her, and that I was left with nothing. Guests would gasp as I slowly stood, opened the leather folder in my hands, and my lawyer's voice thundered through the room. Not today. Her face drained white with shock, and the empire she thought was hers began to crumble. Remember to like this story, subscribe, and share your thoughts, because here on Grandma Life Stories, we bring you unforgettable tales of dignity, justice, and the unexpected turns of family life. My name is Eleanor Hayes. I am 72 years old, and I have just buried my husband of nearly 50 years. Together, we built a business from nothing, a fortune born of long nights and relentless work. The rain fell over Brookline Cemetery that morning, and the sky pressed low and gray over Boston. I stood by the casket, a black umbrella shielding me from the drizzle, my hands clasped tight. Around me, friends, colleagues, and distant relatives whispered condolences in voices that sounded rehearsed. Their eyes lingered on me longer than comfort allowed. I could see them weighing what came next, as if my husband's empire were already a prize to be divided. Then Victoria appeared. My only daughter, 38, striking as ever, but cold. She came late, walking along the gravel path in heels that snapped against the stones, a crimson dress visible beneath her coat. Her head was held high, her lips curved in the faintest smile, and she looked not like a grieving child, but like someone arriving for a performance. At her side was Richard Coleman, a man whose reputation preceded him. He had once moved in financial circles with confidence, until scandal left him hollow. Now he hovered near my daughter, whispering promises of influence, eager to attach himself to the power she thought she was about to inherit. His eyes flicked over the mourners, sharp and calculating, as though each face were another figure on a ledger. I heard the whispers ripple through the crowd as they noticed her. Now the empire must be hers. 95 million, under her control. Their words carried a sting, not because of the money, but because they reduced a lifetime of sacrifice to a number spoken under umbrellas in the rain. Victoria's gaze crossed mine only for an instant, and then she turned away. No tears fell from her eyes. No softness touched her face. My chest tightened with a familiar ache, the wound of a daughter who had grown further and further from me. The priest closed the service, and people began to drift away. Umbrellas moved like dark sails in the drizzle, and soft footsteps faded across the grass. Victoria did not linger by her father's grave. Instead, she leaned toward Richard, her lips forming words I could not hear, but I could guess. He nodded, a slight, knowing smile on his face. I remained still. The rain tapped against my umbrella, slid across my coat, and dampened the edges of my gloves. Outwardly, I looked composed. Inwardly, I carried both grief and resolve. My silence was not surrender. It was the measure of a woman who had learned when to wait and when to strike. Later that evening, the house was unbearably quiet. The scent of funeral flowers clung to the hallways, and the dining room sat heavy with memories of family meals long gone. On the oak table before me rested the leather folder. Dark, polished, unremarkable to those who did not know its contents. But to me, it was the safeguard of everything my husband and I had built. Years earlier, he had placed it in my hands with a steady voice. If the day comes when this empire is threatened, this will speak for us. I had not wanted to imagine that day, yet here I was, a widow, with a daughter who saw legacy as nothing more than possession. I placed my palm against the folder's surface, feeling the weight of both paper and promise. My husband was gone, but his foresight remained. Through the quiet of the house, I whispered into the air, a vow more than a prayer. Tomorrow she will learn. Tomorrow they will all learn. And with that, the storm that had been brewing beneath the grief began its slow rise. The day after the funeral, I walked into the old chamber at Beacon Hill. The building itself stood like a fortress of history, its dark oak walls and tall arched windows casting long shadows across the polished floor. The air smelled of leather and paper. the kind of scent that clung to power and permanence. People were already gathering, their coats damp from the rain outside, their whispers echoing under the high ceiling. I took my place at the long table, my leather folder resting by my side. My hands did not shake, though my heart knew this moment would draw the first real line in the battle to come. Daniel sat near me, his face unreadable, his hand steady on his own briefcase. He had been my husband's friend, and his presence gave me a quiet confidence. The door opened sharply, and in she came, Victoria. My daughter moved with purpose, her heels clicking against the floor, her head held as though this was already her stage. She wore black, but beneath her coat I caught the crimson of the same dress she had worn to the cemetery. She was not here to mourn. She was here to claim. At her side walked Richard, calm and watchful. His eyes moved quickly across the faces of the room, noting each ally, each potential obstacle. He sat close to Victoria, leaning just enough to remind everyone he was part of her plan. His silence was deliberate. His presence was its own declaration. The executor began to speak, his voice low and measured, reading the preliminary notes of my husband's will. The room settled into silence, though it was the silence of expectation, not respect. Everyone knew the moment would come when wealth and legacy would be divided, and their eyes darted between me and Victoria. Then, without warning, Victoria stood. The chair scraped back with a sound that cut through the solemn air like a blade. She placed both hands on the table and looked around the room with a sharp, confident smile. "Father left the $95 million empire to me," she announced, her voice slicing through the chamber. "Mother doesn't need it anymore." The effect was immediate. Gasps filled the room, a sharp intake of breath from the gathered guests. A woman at the far end dropped her pen. A man cleared his throat too loudly, trying to mask his shock. I heard the rustle of coats, the shifting of uneasy bodies, as though everyone present had just witnessed a boundary torn apart. My eyes stayed on Victoria. Her face glowed with satisfaction, her chin tilted upward as though she had already won. Richard did not clap or speak. He simply nodded once, slow and deliberate, a signal that the move they had rehearsed was now in play. His gaze cut briefly to me, as if daring me to contradict her. Inside me, grief turned to steel. My daughter had chosen this moment, in front of strangers and family alike, to erase me from the legacy I had built with my husband. She had not come to honor his memory, but to crown herself the sole heir. For a breath, I let the silence stretch, let the weight of her words hang heavy. Then I rose. The scrape of my chair against the wooden floor drew every eye back to me. I moved slowly, not with hesitation, but with certainty, the kind that made people lean forward without realizing it. I lifted the leather folder from the table, the same one my husband had entrusted to me. Its surface gleamed under the overhead light. I placed it in front of Daniel. My lawyer adjusted his glasses, opened the folder, and pulled out the document inside. He did not look at Victoria, nor at Richard. He looked only at the room, his voice steady at first, then rising with authority. "Not today," he thundered. The sound of his words reverberated against the wooden walls, echoing with finality. It was not simply a statement. It was a verdict. Victoria froze. Her face, moments ago so alive with arrogance, drained of color. Her lips parted, but no words came. Her hand, resting on the table, trembled slightly before she pulled it back into her lap. The silence that followed was louder than any outburst could have been. The guests shifted uncomfortably, caught between sympathy for me and shock at what they had just witnessed. Eyes darted from Daniel to Victoria to me. Some murmured softly, their voices carrying fragments of disbelief. I did not gloat. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked at my daughter, letting her see in my eyes the truth she had refused to accept. She had underestimated me, underestimated the quiet strength that had held our empire together through decades of struggle. Richard leaned toward her, whispering quickly, but his eyes betrayed him. The calm calculation faltered, replaced by a flicker of unease. He had not expected such a direct counter, not so soon. I turned back to the table, resting my hand once more on the leather folder. My voice, when I spoke, was measured, even, but every word cut with precision. This empire was not built in arrogance. It was built in sweat and sacrifice, and it will not be dismantled by ambition dressed as entitlement. No one responded. No one dared. The tension thickened until the executor cleared his throat and attempted to move the proceedings forward. But the shift had already happened. The lines had been drawn. Victoria sat down, stiff and pale, her fingers clenched tightly in her lap. The declaration she had planned to mark her triumph had turned against her. Yet I knew this was not the end. Her pride would not let her accept defeat so easily. Still, in that moment, I had spoken not with anger, but with resolve. My husband's foresight had given me the weapon I needed, and I had used it. For now, the empire remained safe. For now, the storm had been held back. But I could see it in my daughter's eyes as she stared at me across the table. The storm was not gone. It was gathering. The night after the reading of the will, the Hayes mansion stood in silence. The chandeliers in the dining hall cast sharp light over the long mahogany table. Silver cutlery gleamed, but the air was heavy, too heavy for food or comfort. I sat at the head of the table, my posture steady, my leather folder close by my side. Victoria entered without hesitation, her heels striking against the marble floor, followed by Richard, who trailed her like a shadow. She did not sit until she reached the chair opposite mine. She leaned forward, her elbows on the table, and stared at me as though she were already the master of this house. "Empire needs young leadership," she said with a sharp edge in her voice. "You holding on is suffocating it." Her words dropped like stones into the silence. The same daughter I had raised now looked at me as though I were nothing but an obstacle to be pushed aside. Richard smiled thinly, his voice smooth and poisonous as he added, "She is right. Assets of this size cannot stagnate in the hands of the past. They must expand, break boundaries, move forward." I let his words hang in the air. My fingers brushed the leather folder, not opening it, not even lifting it, but resting there long enough to send a message. This empire was not unguarded. Victoria's eyes narrowed, catching the gesture. "Always with that folder," she spat. "Do you think hiding behind paper makes you stronger than me? You sit there like some gatekeeper, keeping me from what Father wanted me to carry on." Her cruelty burned hotter than the candles on the table. I wanted to ask if she remembered the nights her father and I worked ourselves to exhaustion, the days when money barely covered the bills, the sacrifices we made so she could attend the best schools. Instead, I remained silent. My silence provoked her. She pushed her chair back slightly, her voice rising. "You are afraid, aren't you? Afraid that once I step in, people will see how outdated you are. You cling to that empire as if it's your lifeline, but you are choking it, choking me, choking everything." Richard placed his hand lightly on her arm, not to calm her, but to steady her fire. "Control is not eternal, Eleanor. Power shifts. It is natural." His words were cold, rehearsed, and calculated to wound. I drew in a slow breath. My heart pounded, not with fear, but with fury kept under control. I looked at her across the table, and when I finally spoke, my voice was calm but firm. "You mistake silence for weakness, Victoria. What you call suffocating, I call protecting. This empire is not a toy, not a trophy, not a crown to parade. It is the weight of thousands of lives who depend on it, and your arrogance would destroy it in a heartbeat." Her lips twisted, her chin high. "You think I don't know business? You think I haven't watched? Father believed in me, more than he ever believed in you." Her words stabbed, but I did not let them pierce deeper than they deserved. I knew the truth. My husband had trusted me with every contract, every signature, every strategy that brought us to this fortune. Her father had loved her, but he had not entrusted her with responsibility. That difference was the wound she carried, and the reason she lashed out now. Richard leaned closer to her and whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "Push harder, she cannot hold forever." Victoria rose suddenly from her chair, her hand slamming against the table, making the cutlery jump. "You are standing in my way. Everyone knows it. You should step aside before you embarrass yourself." I met her fury with stillness. My hand remained on the folder. My voice cut through her anger like a blade. The only embarrassment here is a daughter who mistakes inheritance for entitlement." Her face flushed, her breath quickened, but she said nothing more. The silence that followed was not calm. It was charged, electric, ready to break at any second. Richard finally broke it with a sly smile. "We will see, Mrs. Hayes. The world moves quickly, and soon enough, this empire will too." Victoria gathered her coat, her movements sharp and defiant. She turned at the doorway, her eyes full of disdain. "You cannot stop me. Not with that folder. Not with your age. You are finished." I did not move, did not rise to chase her words. I sat still, my hand steady on the folder, the fire in my chest controlled but alive. She left the room with Richard close behind, their steps echoing down the marble hall like a threat. Alone again in the vast dining room, I looked at the place where she had sat, the wine glass still untouched, the chair pushed back as if she had fled a battlefield. My throat tightened, not with tears, but with the weight of what had just been declared. She had spoken the truth of her intentions. No more masks, no more polite words. To her, I was the enemy, the final wall between her and the fortune she craved. I whispered to the silence of the hall, "If she has chosen to make me her obstacle, then she will learn what it means to push against stone." I rose from my chair, gathering the folder under my arm, and walked out of the dining room. Each step echoed like a vow. The empire was not hers to take, not now, not ever. The morning after that brutal dinner, the city of Boston woke to headlines splashed across every paper and screen. "Daughter declares control over $95 million empire." The words glared back at me from the newsstand outside my gate, bold and merciless. The photograph showed Victoria, chin lifted, her eyes blazing with the false confidence Richard had poured into her. She looked every inch the heiress she believed herself to be. I knew immediately who had orchestrated it. Richard's hand was all over the sudden flood of articles, the perfectly framed photographs, the carefully planted quotes. He understood the hunger of the press, and he fed it well. The storm he wanted had begun, and he had placed my daughter at its center like a shining figurehead. By noon, reporters crowded the gates of the Hayes mansion. Microphones shoved forward, flashes of cameras struck my eyes, and their questions fell in a hail. "Mrs. Hayes, is it true your daughter is taking over the empire? Is the fortune really hers now? Do you intend to fight her claim, or are you stepping aside?" I walked down the stone steps slowly, deliberate in every movement, my leather folder tucked under my arm. Their voices clashed like thunder, but I did not flinch. I let the noise swell, let the cameras snap, and when the questions grew too frantic, I lifted my hand just slightly. The sudden hush was sharp, eager for my reply. "Justice will answer," I said firmly. Nothing more. The words cut through the air with precision. They gave nothing away, yet promised everything. The reporters erupted again, shouting, scrambling for more. But I did not stay. I turned and stepped into the waiting car. The door shut, and their voices were sealed outside like a storm battering glass. Inside the car, the silence was thick. Daniel sat beside me, his jaw tight. "They are building her into a spectacle," he said quietly. "Richard knows exactly what he is doing. He is pushing this beyond family. He is turning it into a war of perception." I looked out the tinted window as the mansion disappeared from sight. Then perception will meet reality, and reality will not bend for them. Later that afternoon, the television blared with Victoria's voice. She had granted a full interview, sitting in a sleek chair, styled like the leader she pretended to be. Cameras loved her beauty, her sharp features, her carefully chosen dress. She smiled when she spoke, but the words were knives aimed at me. "My father always believed in progress," she declared. "He wanted me to carry on what he built. But my mother, she clings to the past. She suffocates the empire instead of letting it breathe. It is time for a new era." The interviewer leaned forward. "So you are saying your mother is unfit to lead?" Victoria nodded, her expression unwavering. "She is unfit. She refuses to let go. She hides behind papers and lawyers. But I will not let his legacy die with her fears. This empire is mine to lead, and I will not be stopped." I watched her speak with the conviction of someone convinced of her own story. But I knew the truth. Those words were not entirely hers. They were Richard's, dressed in her voice, rehearsed until they cut like glass. The interview spread like fire. Online, people took sides. Some admired Victoria's boldness, praising her for stepping into power. Others condemned her cruelty, questioning how a daughter could dismiss her own mother so easily. But one thing was clear. The private fracture of our family had been dragged into the public arena. That evening, as I sat in the library with the folder on the desk before me, Daniel returned with another report. He placed the newspaper down, the ink still fresh. "They are painting you as the obstacle now, the cruel matriarch who refuses to pass the torch." I placed my hand on the folder, my husband's foresight within it. "Let them," I said. "Truth has its own weight. It will hold when their lies collapse." But in that moment, I understood what Richard had done. He had shifted the battleground. It was no longer about inheritance within these walls. It had become a scandal carried by every voice in Boston, a story that spread with each headline and every screen. The next day, when I stepped outside again, I felt the eyes of strangers on me, measuring, judging, whispering. Some looked with pity, others with suspicion. My daughter had turned me into a figure of controversy, and Richard had sharpened the narrative so that it cut into every corner of society. Yet even as the storm raged louder, my resolve hardened. The empire was not built on image or applause. It was built on contracts, on law, on truth. And while they played their games in the spotlight, I carried the one weapon that could silence all their noise. I whispered to myself as I closed the folder that night, "The louder they shout, the harder they will fall." And for the first time, I no longer feared the scandal. I welcomed it, because the more public the battle became, the more crushing the revelation would be when the truth finally stood before them all. It was close to midnight when the heavy knock echoed through the marble halls of the Hayes mansion. I had been sitting in the study, the leather folder open before me, reviewing documents my husband had left in my care. The knock was not one of courtesy. It was loud, impatient, and insistent. When I opened the door, there stood Victoria with Richard beside her. The rain had dampened her hair, but her eyes burned with fury. Richard's smirk was cold, his presence radiating control as though he had orchestrated every step that led them to my threshold. She pushed past me without waiting for permission, her heels striking the wooden floors like hammer blows. "We're done waiting," she announced, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I want the keys to Father's office. From now on, I'll be running things. This house, this empire, it belongs to me." Richard followed, closing the door softly behind him, his tone dripping with false politeness. "Eleanor, it is better to avoid unnecessary conflict. Hand over the office. Let the young blood carry the weight. You've done your part." I stood still, my fingers brushing the edge of the folder on the desk. I had been expecting this, though perhaps not so soon, not so brazenly. My heart did not race. My voice, when it came, was steady. "Empire is not a game," I told her. "It is sweat and blood, built by your father and me when no one believed in us. You don't inherit sacrifice, you earn it." Her laugh was sharp, almost cruel. "Earn it? Sitting here, clinging to papers, hiding behind lawyers while the world moves on? You don't work, Mother. You just spend. You bleed this empire dry while pretending to protect it." I stepped forward, closing the space between us, my eyes locked on hers, unflinching. "You call your father's life's work a burden. I call it survival, victory, legacy. If you think I will hand it to you simply because you demand it, you don't know me at all." Her jaw tightened, her hand slammed onto the desk, scattering the documents I had been reviewing. "You're in my way," she hissed. "Every second you sit in that chair, you make me smaller, weaker. You want me to fail. But I will not. I will tear this empire out of your hands if I have to drag you into court myself." Richard spoke then, his voice smooth, calculated. "Victoria has the will to lead, Eleanor. You don't." You can resist for a while, but in the end, the law will bend to her side. Public opinion already has. You should spare yourself the humiliation and step down." I turned my gaze to him, and my voice hardened. "You have no place in this family, Richard. You whisper poison into my daughter's ear, but understand this: the empire you salivate over will never belong to you." Victoria's face flushed red. She leaned closer, her words sharp as glass. "You think I'm your little girl, still waiting for your approval. I'm not. I'm the rightful heir, and you're just the obstacle standing between me and what's mine." For a moment, the air crackled with her fury, but I did not flinch. I placed my hand firmly on the leather folder, drawing strength from the knowledge within it. "If you wish to face me in court, then prepare yourself, because truth will not bow to arrogance." The silence that followed was unbearable. Even Richard's smirk faltered for an instant. Victoria grabbed her coat, her movements violent, the chair behind her toppling to the floor with a crash. "This isn't over," she snapped. Her voice trembled with rage, but beneath it was the hollow echo of desperation. "I'll see you in court, Mother, and when I win, you'll have nothing." She turned sharply and strode out, Richard close behind, his eyes meeting mine one last time with a cold, mocking glint. The door slammed, and the sound reverberated through the halls long after they were gone. I stood in the quiet mansion, the echo of their intrusion still hanging in the air. My hand pressed against the folder, not in fear, but in resolve. She believed she had wounded me. She believed she had stripped away my power, but she had only revealed the depth of her desperation, the lengths she was willing to go. I whispered into the silence, my words steady as stone. "If she wants war, then war she shall have, but it will not be on her terms." Bateau, and as the rain battered against the windows, I felt no dread, only certainty. She had declared her battle. I was ready to fight it. The morning after Victoria stormed out of the mansion, the house was heavy with silence. I walked into the study, the folder in my hand, when Daniel arrived. He carried with him not just his own briefcase, but a different kind of weight, the kind of weight that changes battles. He closed the door firmly behind him, set his case on the desk, and looked at me with steady eyes. "Eleanor," he said, "there is something I have kept back until the right moment. I believe now is that moment." I studied him, searching for any sign of hesitation. But Daniel's expression was firm, his tone deliberate. He opened his briefcase and drew out a bound document, its cover worn from careful handling. He laid it in front of me. "This is your husband's living trust," he explained. He signed it before he passed. "It overrides the will in every meaningful way." I opened the pages slowly, reading the familiar strokes of my husband's signature, his careful language carved into every line. The trust was clear, absolute. All rights, all control, all decisions concerning the empire remained in my hands until my death. Not to be shared, not to be contested, mine alone. The word struck me with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief, because the empire was protected. Sorrow, because he had written this with the quiet knowledge that his daughter might one day rise against me. My chest tightened as I whispered, "He knew." Daniel nodded. He knew Victoria's ambition was easily fed. He worried about what would happen if the wrong people circled her. I set the pages down and pressed my hand against them. The empire was not simply a matter of wealth. It was the weight of lives, employees, families who depended on its stability. My husband had trusted me, not her, because he knew what she would do with unchecked power. I let out a slow breath, the room pressing down on me. "Victoria doesn't know," I said. "But Richard does. That's why he's pushing this so hard, isn't it?" Daniel's eyes sharpened, his jaw tight. "Exactly. He's not after Victoria's happiness. He's after this trust. If he can tear it apart in court, he gets everything he wants. Victoria is only his vessel." The realization cut deeper than any insult my daughter had thrown at me. Richard's ambition was not only dangerous, it was calculated. He had chosen Victoria because she was wounded enough, proud enough, desperate enough to be his weapon. and he knew if he could twist her against me, he could reach for the empire itself. I spoke softly, but my words carried steel. Then this was his plan from the beginning, not to support her, but to use her. Daniel leaned closer, his voice low, as though even the walls might be listening. I believe he has already started to move against the trust. He's spreading doubt, building a narrative that you are unfit, that you are clinging to power past reason. If he can push this into court, he'll argue to dismantle the trust itself. He's not fighting you over inheritance, Eleanor. He's fighting you over legitimacy. I felt the heat rise in my chest, not fear, but fury sharpened into clarity. Then he has underestimated me. This trust is not paper. It is my husband's final word. And if Richard thinks he can rewrite it, he will learn the cost of his arrogance. For a moment, silence hung between us, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Then Daniel spoke again. We have to be ready. He will not stop at words or scandal. He will try to corner you legally, financially, and publicly. The trust is ironclad, but Richard will fight like a man who has nothing left to lose. I closed the document, slid it back into the leather folder, and fastened it with deliberate care. My voice was steady, but the steel inside it was undeniable. Let him come. Every attack will only prove what he is, and when the truth stands, he will have nothing. Daniel studied me for a long moment before nodding. Then we prepare, not for peace, but for war. When he left, I remained in the study, the folder resting beneath my hand. I could almost hear my husband's voice in the silence, the calm assurance of a man who had built something with both strength and foresight. He had given me this final shield, and I would wield it with the same relentless will that carried us through decades of struggle. Victoria believed this fight was about her inheritance, but I now understood the deeper truth. This was not daughter against mother. This was me against Richard, a man whose hunger disguised itself as guidance, whose greed wore the mask of ambition. And though Victoria did not yet see it, she was not his equal. She was his pawn. I whispered into the dim light of the study, more to myself than to anyone else. He came for the trust, but he will find me instead. The night outside pressed heavy against the windows, but inside me there was no fear, only fire. That night, after Daniel left, I sat alone in the study with the leather folder closed in front of me. The fire in the hearth burned low, its embers glowing faintly, and the house seemed too vast, too empty. My thoughts drifted backward, pulled into memories I had buried under years of labor and silence. I saw us again, my husband and I, in that tiny apartment in Cambridge. We had nothing then. A sagging couch, a table too small to hold both dinner and the papers we worked on, walls thin enough to hear the neighbors fighting at night. Yet inside that cramped space, we forged the beginnings of what would one day become the empire everyone now fought to control. I remembered the long nights hunched over ledgers, the endless days running from one meeting to the next, the rejection letters piled so high they nearly buried our hope. My husband's voice still echoed in my ears. We don't stop, Eleanor, not until it is real. We carried that fire together. We turned pennies into dollars, failures into lessons, and each setback into another reason to fight harder. By the time the first contract broke in our favor, we were already too hardened to doubt, and slowly, brick by brick, the empire rose around us. But in those years, something else was happening, something I refused to see. Victoria was small then, a child with wide eyes who lingered in the doorway as we worked late. She watched us scribble notes, whisper strategies, argue over risks, celebrate rare victories. She was there, but she was not with us. Her toys gathered dust while we buried ourselves in business. Her drawings were left taped to the refrigerator, admired for a second before the phone rang again. One memory seared sharper than the rest. She was no older than 10, standing in the kitchen, clutching a paper where she had written in crooked letters, "I want to help you, Daddy." She had brought it to her father, her face alight with the need to be seen. He glanced at it, kissed her forehead, and said gently, "One day, Victoria. For now, let Mother handle this." Her smile faltered. I told myself she would understand, but in her silence, the wound was already taking root. Years later, when she was a teenager, that silence broke into words. She stood in the hallway, trembling with anger, her voice shaking as she shouted, "You don't believe in me. You never have. Father only trusts you, Mother, never me." I had tried to soothe her then, but the truth was written on her face. The little girl who once wanted to help had become a young woman convinced she was invisible. Now, sitting in the present, I understood what Richard had found in her. Not just ambition, not just pride. He had found the wound she carried from childhood, the wound of being overlooked, the wound of believing her father's trust was given to me and never to her. Her cruelty now, her venom, her public betrayals, they were not born in a single moment of greed. They were born from years of feeling lesser, of watching me stand beside her father as his partner in every decision while she felt locked outside the door. And though her words now were sharpened to cut me, the echo of her pain still lingered in my memory. "Father didn't trust me. He only trusted you." I leaned back in my chair, staring into the dying fire. The realization did not weaken my resolve, it clarified it. I could not allow her wound to dictate the future of the empire. Pain twisted into power was dangerous, and with Richard whispering into that wound, feeding it, sharpening it, she had become something I barely recognized. Yet deep inside, the mother in me still mourned. I had wanted to believe that love alone could bridge the years we had lost, but love without presence had left scars, scars that Richard now wielded like weapons. I whispered into the room, as though she could hear me even from miles away. "I never meant to make you feel forgotten, but your father and I built this for you to inherit with dignity, not to seize with rage." The flames in the hearth flickered low, shadows dancing across the walls. I closed my eyes, the past pressing heavy on my chest. But when I opened them, the sorrow was gone. All that remained was resolve. Victoria's wound might explain her actions, but it did not excuse them. She had chosen her path, and now she walked it hand in hand with a man who sought to destroy everything her father and I had created. I pressed my palm against the leather folder once more, feeling the solid weight of the trust within. My husband's voice echoed back through time, steady and sure. "If the day comes when you must defend it, do not hesitate. Protect it, Eleanor. Protect everything we built." And in that moment, I knew. The past had left its scars, but the present demanded strength. Victoria's pain might have birthed her fury, but it would not be allowed to topple what generations depended on. I whispered again, firmer this time. "If Richard thinks he can turn her wound into my weakness, he will learn otherwise." The fire dimmed to embers, but inside me, a different fire burned brighter than ever. The war moved quickly after that night. Richard wasted no time turning shadows into weapons. Within days, the headlines shifted again. They no longer asked if Victoria might inherit. They proclaimed it as though it were already fact. The true heir emerges, Victoria Hayes, chosen successor of the empire. Yes. I stared at the paper in my study, the ink still damp, the photographs capturing Victoria in her calculated poses, smiling before microphones, her hand lifted as if she were already giving commands. She looked radiant to the public, but I knew better. The hand guiding her every step was Richard's. Daniel entered without knocking, his face tight. He dropped a folder onto my desk. "They have produced a witness," he said. I opened it and saw the name. A man who had once worked for us years ago, in the early days when our company was just learning to crawl. My husband had dismissed him for misconduct, but now, here he was again, his bitterness recycled into testimony. The statement claimed that my husband had promised Victoria the empire outright, that he had confided his intent to bypass me entirely. The words on the page were lies, but lies crafted with just enough memory to sting. I clenched my jaw. Richard dug him up. Daniel nodded grimly. "Paid, persuaded, threatened, whatever it took. The man is on every outlet now. They're running his face across television, calling him a loyal insider, someone who knew your husband's wishes better than anyone else." I set the paper down, my hand pressing against it as though I could crush the lie into dust. And the people believe him? Not all, Daniel said, but enough. A few of the smaller shareholders are wavering. They see Victoria as young, dynamic, supported by the press. They fear being left behind if they stand with you. The betrayal was not a surprise, but it cut nonetheless. These were men and women who had once shaken my hand, who had sat at my table. Now they bent in the direction the wind blew strongest, forgetting the decades of stability my husband and I had given them. That evening, I watched Victoria's latest interview. She sat across from a host who leaned in eagerly, feeding her the stage she craved. "My father believed in me," she said, her voice sweetened with false humility. "He always told me I had the vision to carry his dream forward. My mother, well, she never saw it, but he did." The host nodded gravely, as though this were gospel. "And now we have testimony from a longtime employee who confirms your father intended for you to take control. Do you feel vindicated?" Victoria smiled, and her words were precise, rehearsed. "I feel ready. The empire needs me, and I won't let it down." Richard sat just outside the frame, but I could feel him there. His hand was in every syllable, every pause, every look to the camera. He knew how to shape perception, and now he was crafting Victoria into a symbol. When the program ended, I turned off the television and sat in the dim quiet. My heart burned with both anger and clarity. I whispered to myself, so this is his counterattack. Lies dressed as truth, and people too eager to believe. The next day, Daniel called a meeting with several shareholders. We gathered in the boardroom, the city of Boston visible through the tall glass windows behind us. The men and women who once trusted me now shifted uneasily in their chairs, their eyes darting, their questions sharp. "Mrs. Hayes," one of them began, "the testimony cannot be ignored. If your husband promised your daughter leadership, perhaps it is time to honor that." I leaned forward, my voice firm. My husband made no such promise. He left his wishes in writing, in a living trust that stands unbroken. Words whispered by a bitter man cannot erase what is written and signed. Another shareholder cleared his throat. "But the press is against you. The public believes Victoria. The longer this drags on, the more unstable the company looks. Stability is everything." I held their gaze, each one of them. Stability is not built on lies. It is built on truth. And if you waver now, you risk more than bad press. You risk becoming complicit in deceit. The room fell silent. Some shifted uncomfortably, others avoided my eyes. I could see it. They wanted to believe me, but fear was stronger than loyalty. When the meeting ended, Daniel walked beside me down the corridor. His voice was low. "They are divided. Some will hold with us, but others are slipping. Richard's play is working." I tightened my grip on the folder I carried, the leather worn from constant use. "Then we fight harder. We do not let their noise become truth." That night, as I stood by the window of the mansion, the city lights glittering below, I thought of Victoria. I thought of the girl who once felt invisible, now standing on stages where every camera adored her. She believed this moment proved her worth. She believed the world was finally seeing her. But what she could not see was the man standing behind her, the one pulling the strings, the one who wanted not her triumph, but her downfall once she had served his purpose. I placed my hand against the glass, my reflection staring back at me. "Richard may think he has found new ground," I whispered, "but this empire is not built on sand, and when the tide comes, it will sweep him away." For now, though, the advantage was his. He had turned perception into a weapon, and perception was powerful. The battle was shifting, and the storm was only growing louder. I had watched them twist lies into headlines, dragging my name through mud and turning my daughter into a stage prop. Richard's hand was all over it. The bitterness in the air was thick, but I knew there was only one way forward. Strip away the shadows they thrived on. Show the world what truth looked like. So I opened my doors. On a gray afternoon, the gates of the Hayes mansion swung wide, and for the first time in decades, reporters were welcomed inside. Cameras followed me as I walked them through the grand halls, past the portraits, past the rooms that had been filled with both struggle and triumph. This empire, I told them, my voice steady, was not inherited. It was built. I led them into the archive room, where shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, stacked with contracts, agreements, letters of partnership. The scent of old paper hung heavy, the scent of history. I pulled out the very first contract my husband and I had signed, ink faded, corners frayed. This, I said, holding it up so the cameras could see, was the moment we stopped being dreamers and became builders. Every line, every signature came with risk, with sacrifice. This is what legacy is built on, not entitlement. I moved slowly along the shelves, showing them the documents one by one, the first expansion deal, the breakthrough investment, the letters from banks that once rejected us, now preserved like scars turned to trophies. And then, beside the papers, I showed them the photographs. There we were, my husband with his sleeves rolled, me with ink on my fingers, Victoria as a child curled on the sofa in the corner, photographs of family dinners cramped into that Cambridge apartment, birthdays celebrated with cake bought on borrowed dollars, our faces tired but alight with determination. The reporters were silent, their cameras clicked, but their eyes softened. One of them whispered to another, "This is not greed, this is history." I paused by a frame where Victoria was small, no more than 7, holding her father's hand. The smile on her face then was real, unbroken. I let the cameras linger there before I spoke. This empire was never about money alone. It was about building something that outlived us, something strong enough to shelter those who believed in us. That is what my husband left behind. That is what I protect. When I turned back, I could see tears in a few eyes. I knew then the tide was shifting. People could feel authenticity when it stood in front of them, but the peace did not last. As we stepped back into the hall, the sharp click of heels echoed against marble. Victoria appeared, her face flushed with fury, Richard trailing close behind her. The cameras swung instantly in her direction. "You think this changes anything?" she shouted, her voice raw, desperate. "You think parading old papers makes you righteous? All it does is prove you never saw me. You kept me out of these rooms, out of this history, like I was a stranger in my own house." Her words cracked through the silence, and the cameras drank them in. She stepped closer, pointing at the shelves. "Every photograph, every memory. You made sure you were there, not me. You built this empire with Father and locked me outside. And now you want to show the world how perfect you were, while I was nothing but a shadow in your story." The bitterness in her voice was no longer just performance. It was pain, naked and exposed, twisted into rage. I stood still, letting her words pierce the air. My chest tightened, but I did not answer in anger. Instead, I placed my hand firmly on the folder in my arm and said, "You were never a stranger to us, Victoria. But love is not the same as readiness. We built this with blood and nights you never saw, and we protected you from it. That protection was not rejection." She shook her head violently, tears brimming but burning away in her fury. "Lies! You made me nothing, and I will take back everything you denied me." Richard leaned in, his whisper sharp but audible to the microphones. "You don't need her approval. Let the world see her weakness." Victoria straightened, turning to the cameras again. Her eyes blazed. "She wants you to believe she is the guardian of legacy, but she is just the jailer of progress. This empire will be mine, and no wall of contracts will stop me." The reporters erupted in shouts, their microphones thrust between us. The scene had turned electric, the contrast undeniable, my calm resolve against her spiraling fury. I lifted my hand, silencing the noise. "The empire is not mine. It is not yours. It is larger than either of us, and truth, not anger, will decide who protects it." Her face hardened, pale with rage, and without another word, she spun on her heel and stormed out. Richard followed, his expression unreadable but satisfied. The cameras turned back to me. Their lenses captured the steadiness in my eyes, the quiet certainty in my voice. "You asked me why I fight," I told them. This is why, because when fury and ambition collide, only truth can protect what matters. When the reporters left that evening, I knew the narrative had shifted. The public had seen not just the Empire's papers and photographs, but the fracture in my daughter's soul. And though some would call it spectacle, many more would see the truth behind it. But I also knew what the outburst meant. Victoria was no longer hiding her bitterness. She was no longer satisfied with whispers or staged interviews. She had declared open war, and the cameras had captured every second of it. I closed the doors of the mansion behind me, the silence swallowing the echoes of her voice. My hand rested once again on the folder. The storm was reaching its peak. And for the first time I realized my daughter was not just fighting me. She was fighting the very ghost of her father, the trust he had placed in me, the legacy she believed had denied her. The battle ahead would not only be brutal, it would be personal. The courthouse in Boston had never looked so suffocating. Cameras lined the steps, their flashes sparking like lightning against gray skies. Crowds pressed against the barriers, shouting questions, holding up signs, some calling Victoria the rightful heir, others denouncing me as a thief. It felt less like the pursuit of justice and more like a theater where my daughter and Richard had written the script in advance. Inside, the courtroom was overflowing. Reporters filled the benches, pens scratching, cameras ready. The air buzzed with tension, the scent of coffee and damp coats mingling with something more acrid. Anticipation sharpened into bloodlust. I took my place at the defense table beside Daniel. The leather folder rested in my lap, though for now it remained closed. Across the aisle, Victoria sat upright, her chin lifted, her eyes burning with a mix of triumph and fury. Richard leaned close to her, whispering as though feeding her lines. She didn't look at me. She looked past me, toward the judge, the jury, the press, as if she had already won. The gavel struck. The trial began. Victoria rose first, her voice firm, rehearsed, carrying across the room with ease. "Your Honor, I stand here not only as a daughter, but as the rightful heir to my father's legacy. My mother has hidden documents, manipulated trusts, and stolen what was never hers to claim. My father told me, many times, that the empire was meant for me, but she has twisted his words and taken what he built for her own." Gasps rippled through the gallery. The press scribbled frantically, the words "stolen legacy" already forming their headlines. I sat still, my face calm, though my stomach twisted. Then came the witness. The man Richard had dug out of obscurity stepped forward, his hair thinner, his voice scratchy, but his story smooth as oil. "I worked with Mr. Hayes for years," he said, his hand raised in oath. "I remember him telling me more than once that his dream was for Victoria to lead the empire. He said Eleanor didn't have the vision. He said his daughter was the future." The jury leaned forward. The reporters nearly climbed over their benches. It was the lie dressed in just enough memory to feel like truth. Daniel stood to cross-examine, his tone sharp but controlled. "Did you leave the company under disciplinary circumstances?" The witness shifted uncomfortably. "That's irrelevant." "It is very relevant," Daniel pressed. "Were you or were you not dismissed for misconduct involving falsified records?" Murmurs filled the courtroom. The man's face reddened. "That was years ago. Has nothing to do with what Mr. Hayes confided to me." Victoria leaned forward in her seat, glaring at me as though the exchange was my fault. Richard sat back, smirking, knowing full well that mud-throne often stuck even when truth tried to wash it away. When the witness stepped down, the damage had already been done. The press scribbled faster, the words "insider confirms father's wishes" flashing across phone screens before the gavel could call order. The judge turned to me. "Mrs. Hayes, you will have the opportunity to respond. Until then, please remain seated." I nodded. My hands were still, but inside me a storm raged. My daughter's voice had cut through me like glass. Manipulator, thief, usurper. Words sharpened by Richard's hand, but spoken with her conviction. For the rest of the day, Victoria paraded herself as the victim of a mother's greed. She spoke of neglect, of feeling invisible, of being locked out of the empire built in her name. Her voice trembled at just the right moments, and the jury leaned closer, moved not by evidence, but by emotion. At one point, she turned toward the cameras and declared, "My father trusted me, my mother never did, and now she wants to erase me entirely." The room gasped. Reporters scribbled. I sat silent, my heart tightening at the echo of words she had once shouted in our hallway as a teenager. The wound had never healed. Now it was being weaponized. By the time the gavel struck to close the day, the narrative outside the courthouse was already clear. The media swarmed, calling Victoria the brave daughter standing against her mother's tyranny. Headlines screamed about betrayal, fraud, generational war. I walked out surrounded by reporters, shoving microphones toward my face. "Mrs. Hayes, how do you answer the charge of fraud? Did you really steal your husband's empire from your daughter? Will you step down before the court forces you?" I paused at the top of the courthouse steps, the weight of every eye upon me. Daniel whispered, "Say nothing." But I lifted my head and spoke, my voice cutting through the chaos. The truth does not fear lies. And when truth is revealed, this empire will stand where deceit collapses. Flashes blinded me. The crowd roared with questions, but I turned, descended the steps, and entered the waiting car. Inside, Daniel exhaled slowly, his face grim. "They've taken the upper hand for now," he said. I looked down at the folder in my lap, my husband's trust heavy in my hands. Let them. A storm always looks strongest before it breaks. For the first time in weeks, I felt the sting of being cornered, but I also felt the fire that came with it. They thought the trial would bury me. They had no idea it would ignite me instead. The second day of trial began with sharper claws. The courtroom was more crowded than ever, every seat filled, the air hot with tension. I sat at the defense table, my back straight, the leather folder in my lap. I could feel eyes on me, curious, judgmental, expectant. The storm outside had become a storm inside these walls. Victoria's lawyer, a man with a voice like polished steel, rose with confidence. He carried no notes. He didn't need them. His attack was rehearsed, sharpened. "Your Honor, members of the jury," he began, his tone loud enough to echo off the wooden panels. "This case is not about love or grief. It is about power. The defendant, Eleanor Hayes, clings to power she no longer deserves. She hides behind papers, claiming legitimacy, while the world watches her greed choke the very empire her husband intended for his daughter." He turned toward me, his eyes glinting. "She is outdated, out of touch, an anchor dragging this company backward while the future waits in vain. She has mistaken possession for purpose, control for leadership, and it is time, far past time, for that control to end." Gasps and murmurs rolled through the gallery. His words were sharp, designed not just for the judge, but for the reporters, the headlines, the evening broadcasts. I sat silent. Daniel placed a calming hand on my arm, but I didn't move. I absorbed every word, knowing silence could be both shield and weapon. The lawyer pressed on. "Victoria Hayes is not only the rightful heir. She is the only one capable of carrying this empire forward. The law must not be twisted by sentiment. Justice must not be shackled by a mother's obsession with power. Eleanor Hayes is not a guardian. She is a usurper." The word usurper rang through the air like a bell. Cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled furiously. Across the aisle, Victoria lifted her chin, a satisfied smile curving her lips. She reached for Richard's hand, gripping it tightly, as though the entire performance was her victory lap. Richard leaned back, his smirk calm, his eyes flicking briefly toward me with triumph. I studied them both. Her fingers clenched around his, seeking strength in his presence. His hand rested lightly in hers, steady but cold, as if he were already calculating the next move beyond her. The judge allowed the words to hang, then called for the next witness. Another parade of testimony, carefully chosen, crafted to cast me as an obstacle. Former consultants spoke of my rigid leadership. Analysts claimed the empire needed youthful innovation. Each voice added weight to the scales, pushing them further toward Victoria. I remained silent, my eyes steady, my expression unreadable. Yet inside, the air pressed hard against my lungs. Every false word felt like a stone added to my shoulders. The jury leaned forward, nodding at the performance of Victoria's side. The press whispered about momentum. I heard it in the hallway during recess. It's over for her. The daughter is winning. When court resumed, Victoria's lawyer returned to his theme. "This is not a tragedy of inheritance," he said, his hand slicing through the air. "This is a tragedy of greed. A mother who cannot let go, who confuses herself with the empire, who clutches power not to protect it, but to glorify herself." His voice dropped to a near whisper, forcing the room to strain to hear. "This is not guardianship. This is theft." The word landed heavier than any shout. The silence afterward was suffocating. The gavel struck to end the day. Reporters bolted from the room, racing to file their stories. "Thief! Usurper! Outdated matriarch!" I could already see the headlines. Victoria stood, her smile bright as a flame. She turned to Richard, squeezing his hand once more. Her laughter carried across the aisle as though she had already won. For her, the trial was no longer about truth. It was theater, and she was the star. I rose slowly, my steps deliberate. My eyes found hers. For the briefest moment, her smile faltered, but Richard's hand steadied her again. She looked away, unwilling to meet the weight of my gaze. Outside, the crowd pressed closer. Their questions were sharp, accusatory. "Mrs. Hayes, are you guilty of fraud? Did you steal from your daughter? Will you resign before the verdict?" I did not answer. I entered the waiting car in silence, Daniel following close behind. Inside, the quiet was deafening. "They believe her," he said at last, his voice heavy. "The jury is leaning. The press is leaning. Right now, the scales are not in our favor." I looked out the tinted window at the courthouse disappearing behind us. My reflection stared back, older, marked by grief, but unbroken. "She thinks she has won," I said quietly. "She thinks power is hers because the crowd cheers louder, but the truth is not swayed by noise. Let her hold the advantage now. The fall will be harder." Daniel studied me, then nodded. "Then we prepare for the moment the scales break." The car carried us through the crowded streets, the voices of the world echoing outside. It seemed for the moment that I had been defeated, that my daughter's arrogance and Richard's cunning had cornered me completely. But I knew better. This was not the end. It was only the moment before the storm turns. The third day of trial dawned with a heavy sky over Boston. By the time I entered the courthouse, the press had already declared me beaten. The whispers in the corridors were loud enough to hear without leaning in. "She's finished. The daughter will win. The matriarch is done." I sat quietly at the defense table, my hands folded over the leather folder. Across the aisle, Victoria glowed with a confidence so sharp it almost glittered. She wore it like armor, smiling at the cameras, leaning into Richard's hand as if the empire was already hers. The judge entered, the gavel struck, and the room fell into order. Victoria's lawyer wasted no time pressing his attack, pacing before the jury, his voice rising like a preacher's. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we see here is nothing more than greed preserved in ink. Mrs. Hayes has manipulated papers, hidden intentions, and strangled the future of her own daughter. Legacy is not supposed to be suffocated by one person's obsession with control. Legacy is meant to be passed on." He turned, pointing directly at me. "She is not a guardian. She is a usurper, clinging to her throne while her daughter stands ready to lead." The jury nodded. The press scribbled. And for a moment, the weight of their judgment pressed hard against my chest. Then Daniel rose. He did not pace. He did not shout. He simply placed his hand on the leather folder before me. His voice was calm, but the courtroom bent toward it like iron to a magnet. "Your Honor," he said, "before we let words drown out truth, I must present evidence that has been here all along." Every head turned. Even the judge leaned forward. Daniel opened the folder with deliberate care, withdrawing a thick document bound in blue. He raised it so all could see, his voice resonant, cutting through the silence. "This," he declared, "is the living trust of Mr. Hayes, signed in his own hand, witnessed by 2 impartial parties, and notarized. It is not rumor, it is not memory, it is law." Gasps tore through the courtroom. The reporters bolted to their feet, cameras flashing, pens racing. Daniel stepped forward, handing the document to the clerk, who brought it to the judge. The judge scanned the pages, his brow tightening, his lips pressing thin. Finally, he looked up, his voice grave. "This trust explicitly grants full control of the Hayes empire to Mrs. Eleanor Hayes until her death. It overrides any interpretation of the will. It is binding and legal." The words crashed through the room like thunder. Victoria's face drained of color. She gripped the edge of the table as though it might steady her, her eyes darting toward Richard in silent desperation. But Richard's expression flickered, just for an instant, the mask of control slipping as the weight of the trust struck him squarely. "No," Victoria whispered, shaking her head. Her voice rose, sharp, panicked. "No, this can't be real. He wouldn't do this. He promised me." Her outburst rang through the courtroom. Reporters scrambled to capture every word. The jury turned toward her, their faces shifting, sympathy slipping into doubt. Richard leaned close, hissing under his breath, "Sit down." But his own hand trembled as he gripped hers. I remained still, my eyes on my daughter. I did not smile, did not gloat. My voice, when I finally spoke, was quiet, but clear. "Your father knew what he was doing, Victoria. He built this with me, and he trusted me to protect it until the end. That is not betrayal. That is responsibility." The judge struck the gavel sharply. "Order. This evidence is legitimate. It will be entered into the record. All prior testimony suggesting otherwise is for now irrelevant." The gallery erupted into chaos, some gasping, some whispering, some already running for the doors to feed the story to the world outside. I sat back in my chair, my hand resting gently on the folder. The tide had turned. Victoria collapsed into her seat, her face pale, her lips trembling. The certainty she had worn like armor cracked before everyone's eyes. She looked less like a victor and more like a child who had just been told the world she believed in was never real. Richard's jaw tightened. His mask slid back into place, but his eyes betrayed the fury of a man whose plan had just been split wide open. Daniel returned to his place beside me, his voice low but firm. "The board, the jury, the press, they cannot ignore this. The trust is the law. The law is on your side now." I exhaled slowly, my chest lifting with the weight of years. For the first time since this began, I no longer felt cornered. The empire was safe, for now. But even as relief spread through me, I could feel the air shift. Victoria's humiliation was not the end. It was the beginning of something darker. She would not accept defeat quietly. And Richard, he would not let go of power he had clawed so close to seizing. I pressed my palm against the folder, whispering under my breath so no one else could hear. "The truth stands. But the storm isn't done." The gavel struck again, the trial adjourned for the day. The courtroom emptied in chaos, reporters spilling into the streets, their voices carrying the news to every corner of Boston. And as I walked out beneath the cameras, I knew one thing for certain. Richard would not stop until he found a way to tear the trust apart. But neither would I stop protecting it. The fourth morning of trial began with a strange energy in the air. The courthouse was even more crowded than before, journalists buzzing like hornets, jurors shifting uneasily in their seats. I could not name it then, but I felt it in my bones. Something was about to break. We took our places. Daniel adjusted his tie with calm precision, the leather folder on the desk between us. Across the aisle, Victoria sat straighter than ever, her chin high, her smile sharp, her hand wrapped firmly around Richard's. He leaned in and whispered to her, his voice low and confident. She laughed quietly, believing herself untouchable again. The gavel struck. The judge called for order, and then the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Every head turned. A woman stepped inside, tall, composed, her expression unreadable. I recognized her instantly, Claudia Myers. For years she had been Richard's assistant, the quiet shadow managing his appointments, smoothing his messes, cleaning up after his chaos. And then, one day, she had vanished. People whispered about a falling out, debts unpaid, promises broken. Now she walked down the aisle with measured steps, a small device clutched in her hand. Her heels clicked against the marble floor, each sound cutting through the silence. She approached the bailiff and whispered. Moments later, the judge leaned forward, brows rising. "Proceed," he said. Claudia turned, her voice steady, carrying across the courtroom. "I was Richard Coleman's assistant for nearly 7 years. I recorded conversations at his request to protect him. What I bring today is one he would never want heard." Gasps rippled through the room. Richard shifted, his jaw tightening, his hand slipping from Victoria's. The clerk took the device, connected it to the courtroom speakers, and then his voice filled the chamber. Not his polished courtroom voice, not the smooth tone he used with reporters, but his true one, sharp, greedy, desperate. "Listen, Victoria," Richard's voice said. "Your mother is weak. She'll never give you what you deserve, but with me, you'll have it all. You'll inherit the empire, and once it's in your hands, we'll sell what we need to cover my debts. The company's assets will wipe the slate clean. You get your inheritance, I get my freedom. It's simple." The words struck like thunder. The jury froze. Reporters bolted to their feet, scribbling frantically. The gallery erupted in murmurs that swelled into a roar. At the defense table, I remained still, my hand resting lightly on the folder. Inside, my chest surged with a mix of vindication and sorrow. Across the aisle, Victoria sat frozen, her face drained of color, her fingers twitching against the table. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "That's not... He wouldn't..." But the recording played on, merciless. "You're just the face, Victoria," Richard's voice continued. "They'll follow you because of the name, but I'll run it from behind. You don't need to understand the details, just smile, sign, and obey. You want respect? This is the only way you'll get it." Victoria's lips parted, but no sound came. The courtroom watched her as the mask she had worn for weeks shattered in real time. She turned toward Richard, her eyes wide, her voice breaking. You used me." Richard tried to recover, leaning forward, his voice sharp. "That recording is fake, manipulated, she's lying." But the damage was done. The jury's faces hardened. The judge's gavel struck for order, but the noise would not die. Claudia stepped closer, her tone like a blade. "I kept his secrets for years. I watched him destroy people, manipulate them. But this, using Victoria, tearing apart her family, selling off the empire to cover his gambling debts, I could not stomach. I will not let him rewrite this legacy with lies." Victoria stared at her, then at Richard. Her face was pale, her voice trembling with rage and disbelief. "All this time, all this fighting with my mother, and you never cared. You just wanted the empire to pay your debts." Richard tried to grip her hand again, but she pulled away violently, her chair screeching across the floor. The cameras caught every second. "Don't touch me," she cried. Her voice echoed, raw with betrayal. "You made me your pawn. You turned me against my own blood. You lied to me." The jury leaned forward, every pair of eyes fixed on her, watching as the daughter who had carried herself with such arrogance collapsed into devastation. The judge banged the gavel. "Order. This evidence will be reviewed, but its relevance is undeniable. Counsel for the defense will be given time to present it formally." I looked at my daughter then. For the first time in weeks, she met my gaze. Her eyes were full of tears, full of shame. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came. She looked away, folding into herself, the truth crushing her far more deeply than any verdict could. Richard, meanwhile, sat rigid, his mask cracking. His smooth smile was gone, replaced with fury and panic. He knew the walls were closing in. The courtroom buzzed like a hive, every voice carrying the same story, the villain exposed, the pawn betrayed. I leaned toward Daniel and whispered, "The truth has a way of finding its voice." He nodded, his eyes on the jury. and they just heard it loud and clear. As the gavel struck to adjourn for the day, reporters flooded out, already screaming the headlines: Coleman betrayal exposed, daughter used as pawn, trust confirmed. I rose from my chair, my movements steady, deliberate. The folder rested under my arm, the empire still protected. For the first time, I saw not triumph, but tragedy in my daughter's face. She had wanted so badly to be seen, to be respected, to inherit what she thought was hers. Instead, she had been reduced to nothing more than Richard's disguise, and now the whole world knew it. The final day of the trial came with an air of exhaustion and dread. The courtroom was thick with tension. Every bench filled, every juror restless. Cameras blinked like 1,000 unblinking eyes. I sat at the plaintiff's table, the leather folder resting in front of me as it had from the start, though by now the truth inside it had already spoken louder than any lawyer could. The judge adjusted his glasses, his voice stern and commanding. After reviewing the evidence, including the living trust, corroborating testimony, and the recorded admission, the court finds that the empire legally remains under the control of Mrs. Eleanor Hayes until her passing. The contestation is dismissed. The gavel struck. Its sound was final, sharp as thunder. For a moment, silence ruled. Then the gallery erupted. Reporters whispered furiously into their phones, scribbling headlines that would run across Boston before nightfall. Jurors exhaled in relief, as though the weight of deception had been lifted from their shoulders. Across the aisle, Victoria collapsed into her chair. The arrogance she once wore like a crown was gone, her face blotched red, streaked with tears she could no longer restrain. She shook her head over and over, her voice breaking into a hoarse cry. "Father never believed in me. He never thought I was worthy." Her words pierced me more deeply than any accusation she had hurled in weeks. The pain in her voice was raw, stripped of ambition, laid bare for the world to hear. She was not just angry now. She was wounded, a daughter confessing the truth of her own insecurity. I rose slowly, my knees steady, my voice carrying with the clarity of a blade. "No, Victoria, your father believed in you. He always did. But belief is not the same as blind obedience. You did not lose because he doubted you. You lost because you listened to the wrong voices." Her eyes widened, shimmering with shock and grief. She opened her mouth, but no defense came. Only the sound of her sobbing filled the courtroom. Richard, meanwhile, sat rigid, his jaw clenched, sweat beading across his forehead. He knew his fate was sealed. The judge's next words made it certain. "Mr. Coleman," the judge said sharply, "this court refers your actions to the district attorney for criminal investigation. Fraud, coercion, and conspiracy are not matters we overlook." Richard tried to speak, but his voice cracked. "This is outrageous!" "Silence!" the judge thundered. The gavel slammed again. "You will have your day in criminal court." The bailiffs moved closer, their presence a clear reminder that his power had ended at that moment. I stood straighter, not in triumph, but in solemn acknowledgement. Justice had spoken. But justice is never without scars. Victoria lifted her head, her face pale and wet. "I wanted so badly for him to see me," she whispered. Her words trembled, raw and childlike, echoing through the silent room. "I thought if I claimed the empire, I'd finally matter. I didn't know. I was just being used." I closed my eyes for a moment, gathering myself. Then I met her gaze, steady and unflinching. "Your father saw you, Victoria. I see you. But respect cannot be demanded through cruelty. It must be earned through truth. You chose Richard, and that choice led you here." She sobbed harder, burying her face in her hands. The gallery watched, torn between pity and contempt. Some shook their heads, disgusted at her arrogance, others whispering about how tragedy had consumed her. I felt no joy in her collapse, only sorrow that she had walked so far down the wrong road, mistaking betrayal for loyalty. Daniel leaned toward me, his voice low. "It's finished, Eleanor." I nodded, though inside I knew it was not truly finished. Nothing could erase the scars left on this family, but the empire was safe. The work of my husband's life was preserved, and for that I was grateful. The bailiff escorted Richard out, his shoulders stiff, his glare sharp but powerless. The cameras followed his every step, the mighty man of schemes now reduced to a criminal under investigation. I turned once more to my daughter. She looked at me with broken eyes as though pleading for something she could not even name. I wished, for a fleeting second, that I could take her back to those days in Cambridge when she was small and laughing, when she believed love was enough. But the years had carved their lines, and choices had been made. The judge adjourned. The trial was over. As I gathered the folder and rose from the table, the whispers of the crowd swelled. The mother won. The empire remains hers, the daughter undone by her own ally. I walked past Victoria, pausing only for a moment. She did not look up. I whispered, so softly only she could hear. It was never about me against you. It was always about you against yourself. She gasped quietly, the words cutting deeper than any verdict. And then I left the courtroom, the marble floor echoing beneath my heels, the weight of victory heavy with grief. Justice had spoken. The empire was mine to protect. But the cost was a daughter's soul, lost to ambition, to the wrong whispers in her ear. As I stepped outside into the sharp Boston air, the cameras flashed and questions were hurled. I answered none. My words had already been said where they mattered most. Inside me, a truth settled like stone. This was not triumph. It was survival. And survival in this world was victory enough. Months passed, and the storm that had torn through my family finally settled into silence. The newspapers no longer carried my name on their front pages, but what lingered was not scandal. It was respect. I knew then that I had a duty to transform the empire from a battlefield into something that mattered. That is how the Hayes Foundation was born. I stood on the steps of the Boston Public Library during its opening announcement, reporters snapping photos as young women from across the city gathered. Some were students from community colleges, others single mothers balancing work and night classes. They looked at me not as a wealthy widow, but as someone who believed in them. My husband and I built this empire brick by brick, I told them. It gave us wealth, yes, but wealth is hollow without purpose. This foundation will fund young women with ideas, courage, and the determination to build futures of their own. That will be our family's true legacy. Applause erupted, strong and steady. For once, the cameras captured not a feud, not a scandal, but hope. That evening, I walked alone through the gardens of the Hayes estate. The roses had begun to bloom again after a harsh winter. Their deep red petals glistened in the light rain, resilient and unapologetic. I reached out, brushing one with my fingertips. The leather folder rested under my arm, still intact, but now it felt less like a weapon and more like a symbol, a reminder of what had been fought for and what had been lost. I thought of Victoria. Since the trial, she had vanished from public view. Letters arrived from time to time, short and uncertain, her handwriting shaky. One line still echoed in my mind. I don't know who I am without the empire. My reply had been simple. You are more than what you claim. Find that truth, and you will never be empty. Whether she heard me, I did not know. But I prayed she would. I sat on the stone bench beneath the oak tree, the same place my husband once planned his first contracts. Memories of those early days in Cambridge returned. Two young dreamers with nothing but an idea, sleeping on floors, eating cold sandwiches, working until our hands shook. Empire was not a gift. It was sacrifice layered over sacrifice. And now, I could finally see. The empire itself was never the point. What we built together and how we passed it forward, that was what mattered. I lifted my face to the evening sky, the rain cooling my cheeks. My voice, steady but low, carried into the night. An empire can be divided. Fortunes can change hands. But character and love, those are the legacies no one can steal. Inside the house, the Foundation's charter documents waited on my desk. The first grants would go out within weeks. Lives would change, not because of inheritance or greed, but because people believed in one another the way my husband once believed in me. I rose from the bench, my hand still resting on the folder. The battle had ended. The empire would live on, not as property to be fought over, but as a seed planted in the lives of those who needed it most. The garden fell quiet, save for the steady sound of rain. I stepped back toward the house, leaving the rose blooming behind me, red and defiant against the gray sky. And as the lights of the estate glowed warm against the night, I knew the story had found its true ending. Not in the courtroom, not in the scandal, but here, in the quiet of a choice made with purpose. The screen fades to black.